The sirens began long before the sun had a chance to rise, these long, metallic screams that just tore through the cold Berlin air. For weeks it had been the same story. Bombs fell almost every single night, shaking the entire city, crushing buildings, and completely silencing the laughter that used to fill the cafes, the opera houses, and all the busy streets. Now, Berlin was just a skeleton of its former self, smoking, cracked, and utterly exhausted. Through this apocalyptic landscape, a young man named Emil Hartmann was rushing through the rubble. He was only 24, a German postal clerk who'd become a reluctant soldier. He had a stack of letters strapped tightly to his chest, his uniform was wrinkled, and his boots were worn paper-thin. Emil was never supposed to be a fighter. He was just a messenger. But this was 1945, and in a city like this, messages could be just as dangerous as bullets. Emil had one final mission. He had to deliver one last letter to a woman named Margot Adler. She lived somewhere near the eastern districts, which were now almost completely swallowed by fire and relentless Soviet shelling. This letter wasn't ordinary. It was from Karl Adler, a fallen German sniper, and Emil's closest friend. With his last breath, Karl had whispered to him, "Promise me, she gets this." No matter what, and Emil had promised. So now, carrying the last words of a dying man, he ran through the collapsing city, not even sure if Margot was still alive. The Berlin Emil ran through was unrecognizable. Trams lay overturned like giant dead beetles. Houses were sliced open, looking like broken dollhouses, exposing rooms that would never hold families again. Snowflakes were mixing with ash, drifting down like gray feathers, and the constant boom of artillery was getting closer and closer. "Move! Get underground!" A German officer screamed at him as he ran past, but Emil didn't stop. He couldn't. Promises meant something to him, especially now, in a world where so much had lost its meaning. He passed a group of civilians huddled beside the ruins of what used to be a bakery. A little boy stared at him, clutching a charred wooden toy soldier. The boy's eyes were hollow, far too old for his small face. Emil forced himself to keep moving. He crossed a broken courtyard and suddenly found himself in front of a familiar sight, a shattered post office. He'd worked there just 3 years earlier, stamping letters, chatting with Karl during the slow evenings, dreaming of a peaceful life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. Now, it was all gone. A Soviet shell whistled overhead and exploded right behind him, throwing him violently against a wall. Dust filled his mouth, and his ears were ringing so loudly he couldn't hear anything else. When he finally managed to stand, he saw something in the rubble. A hand, small, fragile. A woman was crushed under the debris, but she was still alive, reaching weakly toward him. "Help! Please!" she whispered. Without a second thought, Emil dropped his rifle and started tearing at the bricks with his bare hands. They were bleeding, but he didn't care. He pulled her free, dragging her behind a fallen column just as more shells shook the ground around them. She coughed, trembling uncontrollably. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Stay here," Emil told her. "The cellar might protect you." She looked at him, her tired eyes questioning. "What about you?" "I have someone to find." Her eyes softened with a hint of understanding. "Then go," she said. "Before it's too late," Emil pushed on, moving through the eastern streets. They were eerily silent now. No soldiers, no civilians, only smoke and the ghosts of what used to be. Then he spotted something, a Soviet scouting patrol. 6 soldiers creeping through the alleys like shadows. Emil ducked behind a burning truck, his heart pounding so loud he was sure they could hear it. A Soviet soldier's voice echoed in Russian. Emil didn't understand the words, but their tone was tense, alert. They were hunting for someone. He held his breath. One of the soldiers walked closer, far too close for comfort. Emil's hand trembled on his weapon. He didn't want to shoot anyone, not after everything he'd seen. Not after losing Karl, but then the soldier stopped. He stared at the ground, right at Emil's footprints in the soot. He knelt down for a closer look. Emil knew in that instant, if he didn't move now, he was dead. He burst from his hiding spot, sprinting down the alley as fast as his legs could carry him. Bullets shattered the bricks right behind him. He dove through a doorway just as a grenade landed exactly where he had been standing. The explosion blew him forward, slamming him hard into a kitchen counter. When he rose, bleeding and dizzy, he saw a photograph on the cracked floor. It was a family portrait. A husband, a wife, and a little daughter, all smiling at a summer picnic. War had erased them. He couldn't help but wonder how many people Margot had lost. He wondered if she was even still waiting for a letter that might never arrive. After another hour of slipping through the ruins, Emil finally reached Carl's last known address. It was a narrow street, half devoured by flames. The building had collapsed inward, its stairwell exposed like a broken rib cage. "Margot?" he shouted, his voice rough. "Margot Adler." There was no answer. He climbed over the rubble and entered what was left of her apartment. The air smelled of smoke and old perfume. A cracked mirror on the wall reflected his own tired, soot-covered face, and then he heard it, a cough. He rushed towards the bedroom, and there she was, Margot. She was lying beneath a fallen beam, her leg pinned. She was pale, her lips were cracked, but she was alive. When she saw Emil's uniform, her eyes widened in fear. "No, no, please," she begged. "I have nothing left." "Don't hurt me." "It's okay," Emil said softly. "I'm not here to harm you." He knelt down, and with all the strength he had left, he gently moved the beam aside. She cried out in pain, but he managed to free her. "You're safe," he said, his voice gentle. "Why?" "Why did you come?" she asked, confused. He pulled the letter from his pocket. It was wrinkled and stained with soot, but it was intact. "I came to give you this." She stared at it as if she were looking at a ghost. "That handwriting, Carl?" she whispered. Emil just nodded, unable to find the words. With trembling fingers, Margot opened the letter. She read it silently as tears streamed down her dirty cheeks. Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs. When she finished, she clutched the letter to her heart as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "He loved you," Emil said softly. "More than anything?" She closed her eyes. "He promised he would come home." Emil swallowed the lump in his throat. "He wanted to." He fought to. A heavy silence filled the ruined room, broken only by the thunder of artillery outside as the Soviet army drew nearer. "Come with me," Emil said urgently. "I'll get you to safety." Margot looked up at him, her eyes filled with a new question. "Why risk your life for a stranger?" "Because Carl saved mine once," Emil answered simply. "This is my way of repaying him." Her eyes softened with gratitude. Just then, the entire building shook violently. "They're shelling the district," Emil said, his voice firm. "We have to go, now." And together, they stepped out into the chaos, a promise kept in the heart of a fallen city. The streets of Berlin were on fire. Margot limped beside Emil, smoke clawing at their throats as explosions shook the ground. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "The western tunnels," Emil replied, his eyes scanning the devastation. "It's our only chance to reach the evacuation point." They stumbled into a shattered plaza, the heart of a city turned to rubble. Suddenly, a Soviet unit appeared at the far end. "Down!" Emil yelled, pulling her behind a broken fountain just as machine gun fire tore through the air. Bullets shredded the stone where they had been standing. Margot screamed, a raw sound of terror. Emil dragged her behind a statue as sparks flew from the stone. "We can't stay here," she cried, her body trembling. Emil risked a glance. Too many soldiers, too exposed. His heart hammered against his ribs. Then he saw a dark gaping hole in the ground. The subway entrance. "Follow me!" He lifted Margot into his arms, ignoring the sharp, slicing pain in his side. He ran, his lungs burning, the sound of gunfire chasing them like a swarm of angry wasps. They tumbled down the subway stairs, plunging into darkness and silence. The only sound was the dripping of water, a slow, steady rhythm in the underground world. Margot gasped for air. "Thank you." "I thought I was going to die." Emil forced a tired laugh. "So did I, but their relief was short-lived. Shouts from above. The heavy thud of Soviet boots on the pavement. "Run," Emil whispered, and they disappeared deeper into the subterranean maze. The tunnels were a cold, wet labyrinth. Rats scurried through piles of debris, and the emergency lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. Margot leaned on Emil, each step an effort. In the oppressive silence, she finally asked the question that had haunted her. "Tell me the truth. How did Carl die?" Emil hesitated. The memory was a fresh wound. "Carl saved a child," he began, his voice low. "A little girl was caught between our lines and the Soviets. He ran to her, pulled her to safety. But he exposed himself." Margot covered her mouth, her sobs silent, her shoulders shaking. He always said children should never pay for adults' wars, she whispered, her words choked with grief. Just then, a deep rumble echoed from the tunnel behind them. Boots. Voices. The Soviets were down here, hunting them. We need to hide, Emil said urgently. They found a maintenance room, slipping inside and quietly closing the rusted metal door. For a moment, there was only the sound of their own breathing. The world outside ceased to exist. Margot looked at Emil, her eyes searching his. You risked everything to bring me his last words. Why? Emil let out a long, weary sigh. Carl was my brother, not by blood, but he was my brother. I couldn't let his voice just disappear in the noise of this war. Margot's fingers gently touched his hand. Thank you. He looked away, a flicker of shyness in his exhausted face. But the moment of peace was shattered. A beam from a Soviet flashlight sliced through the crack under the door, sweeping across the grimy floor. They're here, Emil whispered. Margot grabbed his arm, her grip desperate. Don't let them take me. Emil's jaw tightened. He raised his rifle. I won't, he vowed. The footsteps grew louder, stopping right outside their door. The door burst open with a crash of splintered wood and twisted metal. A Soviet soldier stormed in, his eyes wide with surprise for a split second. Emil fired once. The soldier fell. More rushed in behind him, a tide of green uniforms and rifles. Get behind the generator, Emil yelled, shoving Margot toward the hulking machine. Run when I tell you. He took cover, exchanging fire with the soldiers. The small room erupted in a storm of noise and light. One enemy went down, then another. A bullet grazed his shoulder, and he gritted his teeth against the searing pain. But there were too many. A grenade, a small metal egg of death, rolled across the floor and stopped near his feet. Without thinking, Emil snatched it and hurled it back through the doorway. The explosion was deafening. The room filled with dust and a high-pitched ringing. He coughed, his vision blurry. Through the haze, he saw more soldiers advancing. Emil, please! Margot's scream cut through the chaos. He turned to her, a pained, sad smile on his face. This is where I stop. You keep going. No, come with me, she begged, her face a mask of horror. I promised Carl I'd protect you, he said, his voice firm. This is the only way. Her sobs were violent, shaking her entire body. Emil, don't do this. He gently pressed Carl's folded letter into her hands. This is your future, not mine. He gave her a final, desperate push toward a small rear exit she hadn't seen. Run, Margot, run. She stumbled back, then turned and ran, her cries of his name echoing in the tunnel behind her. Emil turned back to face the advancing soldiers. He lifted his rifle, the metal cool against his hands. His last thoughts weren't of the war, or the pain, or the fear. They were of Carl, laughing on a summer afternoon. Of Margot's eyes, filled with a hope he had just reignited. Of the promise he had made. The gunfire was a flash of white light. Pain exploded in his chest, a force so powerful it threw him backward. He landed hard, his gaze fixed on the dripping ceiling above. A profound coldness began to spread through him, starting from his chest and reaching out to his fingertips. Through the ringing in his ears, he thought he heard faint footsteps returning. Margot's voice, a distant, desperate whisper. Emil, 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 Emil. Faint footsteps returning. He tried to move to speak, but his body was no longer his own. With the very last breath he had, he formed the words, a silent prayer sent into the darkness. Tell him. I kept my promise. His eyes, which had seen so much horror, slowly closed for the last time. The year is 1946. The war is over. Berlin, a ghost of its former self, is slowly rebuilding from the ashes. Margot survived. She made it out of Germany and found a new life in France, carrying two things with her, Carl's letter and the indelible memory of Emil. The following year, she gave birth to a daughter. She named her Amelia. Every year, on the anniversary of her escape, Margot would write a letter. She'd travel to the rebuilt Berlin post office, a symbol of a future that almost wasn't, and leave the letter near its steps. The message was always the same, to the bravest messenger who delivered more than words. She never forgot him. His name, Emil Hartmann, was never recorded in the history books. He was just another soldier lost to the war. But in the heart of one family, in the legacy of a promise kept, Emil lived forever. Thanks for watching. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe for more tales of unsung heroes.